one. I haven't really said a lot, or not as much as I would like, about poetry in general. I've kind of sketched in a few of the ideas central to the lyric tradition, lyric poetry, which is one of the oldest. They're basically, you could look back to some of the early Greek lyric poets, the most famous one being, where is my thing? Probably the most famous lyric Greek poet is Sappho. She is, even in her day and age, she was considered to be kind of the quintessential master of lyric poetry. There are other ones, we just don't have a lot of their texts. A lot of it was just lost to the ages. We actually don't have a lot of her work. A lot of it has survived in fragments. Anne Carson did a really good translation of Sappho's work. There are quite a few translations out there. Anne Carson, for my money, tends to be one of the best translators of Greek poetry, simply because she's also a great poet in her own right. One of the other, perhaps, I think, most entertaining or interesting lyric poets at the time would have been Archilochus. There are very, very few examples of his work left. Some of his poems actually kind of mock the warrior culture of Greece at the time, kind of in reference to the Homeric tradition in which we see all these heroes, etc. He talks about hiding his shield in a bush and leaving the marching formation to go off and hide, because you know what? War is scary and he didn't want to die. It's more fun to write poems, right? So anyway, what I'm going to look at today are three poems, three poets from hopefully wide enough traditions that you can kind of see that even when we are looking at different languages, different cultures, different attitudes, and different ideas, that the core attention in a poem remains the same. It remains stable across the ages, across the millennia. So we're going to look at a poem by Li Po. We're going to look at a poem by Hart Crane. And then we're going to look at a poem by Jack Gilbert. Hart Crane and Jack Gilbert are American poets of the early, then the mid to late 20th century. Li Po is a Chinese poet from about 1,200 years ago, I think. And he's still just a great poet to read, even in translation. I think the translations here, these were done by David Hinton, and they're, in my opinion, among the best translations, because anytime you translate, especially poetry, you're going to, as Robert Frost said, what is lost in translation is the poetry. But you can still see, even in these translations, the levels of attention, the care, the attention paid to, especially image. Line, as we've discussed, because remember, what we're looking for in poetry is the use, in lyric poetry, the use of the line and attention paid to the image. Okay, a lot of, you could almost say beginning poets, but a lot of poets tend to focus way too much on metaphor. They tend to focus way too much on things like allusions. Okay, if I can pack my poem full of allusions to, famous books or Shakespeare or whatever, then that makes the poem better. Well, sometimes, sure. I mean, you can see this a lot in somebody like T.S. Eliot, the modernists, somebody like Ezra Pound. And I really do love Ezra Pound's work. But sometimes that can be really overbearing. And I know that's something I used to do when I started writing. I was just like, oh, okay, well, if I get a reference to Dante in this poem and a reference to Milton and that, Well, that'll make the poem better. Well, not necessarily. Okay. So what I'm going to focus on in my discussions today are simply the use of line and the use of image in these poems, and then talk about the poem's jumpiness. Okay. Because what we want to try to do in a poem, and this actually goes back to a very useful kind of maxim that Richard Hugo discusses in his book, The Triggering Town, where he said that if you have a poem, right, he said that every sentence, no matter what you're doing in the poem, said every sentence, so here's sentence A, sentence B, sentence C, so every sentence wants to shift focus. Okay, so we have the sentence, we're breaking that sentence across these lines. Okay, this would be an enjambment, end stop, enjambment, end stop. Now, and this is a caesura. So we want the poem to jump. There has to be a kind of leap in, how to put it, an elusive leap from sentence to sentence. Now, not necessarily always from line to line, okay? But from sentence to sentence. And what that's going to do, it's going to give the poem a sense of sprawl. It's going to give the poem a sense of, it's going to push it toward a sense of universality. And this is the main strength of poetry that fiction simply can't do. Okay? Because fiction actually has to focus, as we've discussed, on character, story, action, etc. Right? Whereas a poem doesn't have to embody that. It doesn't have to live inside of those conventions. And this is, like I said, poetry's main strength. So let's look at some of these poems. I had to type this one out. I actually didn't have a PDF version of it. So this is Li Po's poem, Facing Wine. And so right off the bat, he kind of sets off the tone, right? Ha ha ha. Now, Li Po was, and still is, considered probably the greatest Chinese poet. And this is over the course of 1,200 subsequent years. He was a bit of a party animal. He liked his wine and would often get drunk and just kind of write these poems. Sometimes got in trouble for offending people, for court intrigue and all of this. He was exiled from his homeland, kind of like Dante, who would actually be almost a contemporary of his. And so you'll see wine and drinking come up, and that's kind of it's a major theme, and it's not intended to be about getting drunk so much as enjoying the bodily pleasures, the ephemeral pleasures of life, because life itself is ephemeral. And so you see this theme really come up in this poem, and this is, one of many in which this theme takes place. But I want to, just before we start talking about this poem, I want to show you a couple things, or just read them out loud to you, because his influence on 20th century poetry was monumental. And a lot of that came through Ezra Pound's translations of him into English. Ezra Pound, aside from being a really great poet, was a really good translator. And Ezra Pound took some liberties, I think, with his translations in order to make them better poems. Okay, so he was a little bit less accurate in the translations, pushing more toward making the poem itself, or the translation itself, into a poetry machine, you might say. But I just want to read a couple titles, just to kind of show you what a title can do in a poem. Okay, sometimes a title can be really simple, like Facing Wine. Okay, but here's a couple other titles just kind of pulled at random from Li Po's work. Here's one title: Making My Way toward Yelong in exile, I remember walking among peach blossoms long ago at Autumn River. I noticed that that's almost a poem. That's just the title. So you see, it establishes place, it establishes mood, right? The title doesn't have to be simply a placeholder. It can be an active part in a poem. And in fact, if it's not an active part in a poem, and a lot of you will see this in workshop, you're going to see, whoop, cut that title. It's not working. Okay. Here's another one, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of this word terribly. Leaving Koichu City early. Here's another title. Traveling Tongting Lake with Chia Che and my uncle, Li Ye. Here's another title. After climbing Paling Mountain in the West Hall at Kaiwan Monastery, offered to a monk beyond this world on Hang Mountain. Here's another title. At Lung Sing Monastery, Chia and I cut branches from a wutong tree, then gaze at Yong Lake. Here's another title. Drinking alone beneath the moon. Here's another title. Avoiding farewell in a Chinling wine shop. Here's another title. Waiting for wine that doesn't come. So you see, there's a lot of different ways you can approach even the title in a poem. And so when you're writing your own poems, I very much want you to think about how these poems are working, how the titles are working, and how there's an interplay always between what the title's doing and then what the poem is doing. So let's look at this poem. Now, like I said, this is a translation, so the translator has used the lyric convention, which is more or less a Western thing, and applied that to this poem. Okay, so you can see that the translator is very aware of the use of line here, the use of enjambment, which wouldn't have been as prominent a feature in Li Po's poetry, even though he did, yes, use line conventions and especially imagery. Okay, so facing wine. Never refuse wine. I'm telling you, people come smiling in spring winds. Peach and plum like old friends, their open blossoms scattering toward me. Singing orioles in jade green trees, and moonlight probing gold wine jars. Yesterday, we were flush with youth, and today, white hairs and onslaught. Brambles overgrown Shihu Temple, and deer roam Kusu Terrace ruins. It's always been like this. Yellow dust, choking even imperial gates closed in the end. If you don't drink wine, where are those ancient people now? And this poem is just, it's so evocative. And yes, this should be, I apologize, little typo. Now, never refuse wine. Okay, well that's a very kind of evocative little imperative statement. Never refuse wine. Okay, well I won't, but why? Why? Now you see what he does here is he takes this idea and then returns to it at the end. He wanders the poem through a bunch of imagery and a bunch of evocative ideas and themes, and then we see why. We see why we should never refuse wine at the end. So it's actually kind of a bookend type of poem, right? He doesn't immediately explain, right? Now, we get this idea, wine, okay, makes people happy, in moderation. Don't drink and drive. People come smiling. We get this peach and plum blossoms, like old friends, scattering toward him. We get the birds singing in these jade green trees, the moonlight, right, cast over everything. So you see, it's just image, image, image. And you can see these images. You can see these things in your mind. Even though you're not seeing the exact same thing that Lee Poe was seeing in his mind when he wrote this, it evokes the image in your mind. And that is what I mean by using imagery to steer the mood of the poems, to steer the mood of the poem, okay, in order to steer the mood of the reader, okay? Now notice this. Then all of a sudden, he jumps, okay? This is what I mean by the poem's necessary jumpiness. Now, we discussed this in another lecture, but in a sonnet, right, we would call that jump, that shift of attention, the volta, which just means turn. So some poems are going to have a lot of voltas in this sense. The volta is actually technically a feature of the sonnet, where you would have your 1, 2, 3, 4. The volta would come between the two main line sequences. You'd have 8 and then 6. So the volta would come here. Typically, in an English sonnet, it would come between the 12 and 2, the final couplet. But notice here, all of a sudden, we've got image, 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 and then yesterday we were flush with youth. Okay, well, that's a big jump. Today, white hairs and onslaught. Oh, okay, age. So this poem is about getting older, right? This poem is about not just, drinking with your friends or looking at beautiful things and thinking beautiful thoughts, right? It's a meditation on age. And anytime you have a meditation on age, you have a meditation on death. And this is a primary feature of a lot of poets, poems, literature in general. This kind of, how do we contend with death? How do we contend with that inevitability, right? So Lee Poe here suggests perhaps, well, enjoying life, but not just enjoying life capriciously, instead enjoying it for its profundity, paying attention to the blossoms of trees blowing in the wind, wine, bird song, moonlight, okay? And then we get another set of images right after this, okay? This sets up a kind of structural contrast, if you'll notice, okay? Wine, kind of beautiful imagery. Here we get these images of temples, of palaces, whatever, that are decaying, right? That age has caught them. So we might even say that we have this structural feature in the poem. It splits itself pretty much in half. Youth, beauty, nice imagery, right? White hair, age, and then we have, civilization, culture, aging. What time does inevitably not just to people, but to everything. Okay, so you notice that structural feature of this poem. We have Shiu Temple overgrown with brambles, deer roaming this terrace, right? And it's always been like this. The yellow dust closing even choking even imperial gates closed in the end. And then once again, we have this jump, okay? This jump here where he asks this question. And it's about, how would we answer this question? The thing in a poem, and I think this actually was another phrase or another recommendation from Richard Hugo. If you ask a question in a poem, never answer it, okay? And I think that's actually very good because what it does, it engages the reader. It's evocative. It adds some good ambiguity to how we're supposed to read the poem, to how we're supposed to understand it. And if we don't celebrate life now, if we don't drink wine, right, if we don't enjoy our little ephemeral pleasures, right, how can we ever seek to understand, seek to know, seek to locate the ancient people, right? The people who have come before us, the people who, just like us, had ambitions, youth, fun, wine, the ephemeral bodily pleasures, but also the mental, the emotional pleasures, the whole range of what it means to be human. Okay, and I think that that's what good poems challenge us to do, is to live a little more deeply, to see a little bit more clearly, and to think a little bit more perspicaciously, right? To have a broader view of not just ourselves, but our relationship to not just our culture, but culture in general, humanity in general. And here's this 1,200-year-old poem that could have been written yesterday and would still have the same resonance, still have that same kind of drive inside of it. And so the way this poem ends, if we don't drink wine now, where are those ancient, or if we don't drink wine, where are those ancient people now? It doesn't answer. It doesn't, you have to figure out that answer, right? You, the reader, in engaging in this poem, you have to be the one to answer this question for yourself. Not for Li Po, not for Chinese poetry, not for poetry at all, but for yourself. And I think it's just a really beautiful poem because of that contrast of imagery, because of its structure, and because of this wonderful book ending here. We have this opening imperative, and it ends with this evocative question. Now let's turn to this. Oops, I got these out of sequence. Blow this up a little bit for you. Okay. This is a poem by Hart Crane. He was a poet who lived, I believe he was born in 1899 and died in, I want to say 1932, of suicide. He was not a very happy person. He was a closeted homosexual, and you can see some of that come up in, I mean, sometimes in his work, it's like glaringly obvious. But at that time in America, it was not remotely socially okay. Unfortunately, and so he basically lived this kind of lie, and that eventually, the stress of that, right, not being able to be who you are, love the person you want openly, caused it eroded a lot of his, I don't know, brilliance. He's a very brilliant poet, and a very tortured individual. And I don't want people to kind of focus on the tortured aspect, because I think that a lot of the time we think, oh, if you're going to be especially a poet, you have to be tortured, and you have to be gloomy, and you have to wear a beret, and smoke cigarettes and watch French movies. No, you don't. Okay, I'm not saying that you have to be depressed all the time. Now, can happy people write good poetry? I don't know about that. There was actually a survey they did maybe, I think 20 years ago when I read it. And they were looking at the average lifespan of artists by genre. And so what they did was they took, like let's say 100 poets and 100 ballet dancers, 100 fiction writers, 100, whatever, dramatists. And what they found was poets had the next to last life expectancy. So they were next to last, like they died very, very young on average. Very often because of suicide and or drug abuse, alcohol abuse. Number one, the shortest lived were jazz musicians. And that's primarily because of heroin. I mean, I think heroin decimated jazz music from the 1930s onward. So anyway, don't do heroin. Read poems instead. You'll get just as high. Anyway, so this poem is from Crane's first book, White Buildings, and I think it was published around 1926, 27, and it features one of his greatest poems, and I'm not going to read it today, but there's a poem. It's a poem. It's a sequence of poems, 7 poems, called Voyages, and in my opinion, it's the greatest love poem in English. I was actually talking with one of my former professors from grad school, who's actually a very dear friend now, and we both just adore this poem, and we were kind of chatting about it, and he said that number 2 and 5 in the sequence are just unrivaled, perfect examples of poetry, and I think he's right. This poem, Chaplin-esque, is not his greatest poem, but it's perhaps the poem of Hart Crane's that I love the most. And I'll try to kind of run through why I love this poem, and just kind of show you once again, line and image, line and image. So, of course, Charlie Chaplin, that's where the title comes from. In Crane's time, Chaplin would have been basically like the megastar. Chaplin was a huge celebrity because of his movies, deservedly so. I won't say much about his private life. I will leave that out. You can go watch the movie. I think it's called Chaplin. Robert Downey Jr. plays him and does a really brilliant job. It's maybe 20, 25 years old, and it makes it pretty clear in there what I'm talking about. Anyway, so this is a Chaplin-esque. This is a poem in the spirit of Chaplin. So we get that reference. We get it evokes once again a lot of what we would expect from Chaplin, the tramp character, right? Always with his cane, right, twirling it around, running from the police, etc. So, Chaplin-esque. We make our meek adjustments, contented with such random consolations as the wind deposits in slithered and too ample pockets. For we can still love the world, who find a famished kitten on the step and know recesses for it from the fury of the street or warm, torn elbow coverts. We will sidestep and to the final smirk dally the doom of that inevitable thumb that slowly chafes its puckered index toward us, facing the dull squint with what innocence and what surprise. And yet these fine collapses are not lies, more than the pirouettes of any pliant cane. Our obsequies are, in a way, no enterprise. We can evade you and all else but the heart. What blame to us if the heart live on? The game enforces smirks, but we have seen the moon in lonely alleys make a grail of laughter of an empty ash can, and through all sound of gaiety and quest, have heard a kitten in the wilderness. So, why do I like this poem so much? In a way, I can't explain it to you. It's a poem that I read when I was quite young, and it has stuck with me over the years. It's also that I do love Charlie Chaplin's movies. If you haven't seen City Lights, go watch it. If you haven't seen The Kid, go watch it. Gold Rush, go watch it. Modern Times, go watch it. The Great Dictator, go watch it. Shoulder Arms, go watch it. Really, really, really brilliant stuff, and just hilarious. I mean, they're still funny. They're still good. They're still poignant. City Lights is just, I think, his masterpiece. Now, I'm just going to kind of run through, because Crane is actually kind of tricky to read, because he really did aim for packing the line with so much work. And this is one of the things that I learned perhaps the most from him, was this idea of line density. Every line is doing so much. Okay. Now, sometimes his imagery does get a little bit cloudy. If you go and read some of his other work, you'll see this exactly. Like a later poem of his, "The Broken Tower," which is an amazing poem. At times in that poem, you can't, unless you reread it several times, you can't see what he's talking about. You don't know, because he's trying to do a little bit too much with language, and that gets in front of the image. So sometimes he kind of confuses the reader, because his language is too dense. But so we start off with this kind of, you almost could call it a truism. We make our meek adjustments. Well, who? Everybody, okay, people. And adjustments to what? Well, to life, to hardship, to poverty, to loss. We have to be content with random consolations that maybe that the wind deposits. Now here, this idea, the image that we get right here with this wonderful use of slithered, okay? When we think of slithering, we think of a snake. But here the image is the image of like a hand, okay, going into a pocket, right? And if the pocket's empty, right, the hand is kind of slithering around in there, kind of like looking for change or looking for money, right? So he sets up this idea, okay, poverty, hardship, etc. We push back against this, but our adjustments, our resistance is meek, it's random. We find joy how we can. Now, and then this wonderful turn in the next stanza. For we can still love the world. How? Who find a famished kitten on the step, and no recesses for it from the fury of the street or worm-torn elbow cupboards. This idea of, well, no matter how hard hard our life is, there's always going to be something or someone worse off, right? And by helping, by showing this little bit of kindness, picking up a little hungry kitten, and the image here, worm-torn elbow cupboards, is the image of, holding the cat, in your, let's say, sweater or whatever that's falling apart, okay? So we're holding this little cat who is hungry and worse off than us. So we hold it and we show a little bit of kindness to it, a recess from the fury of the streets, okay? And then this really tender image of just simply holding this poor little kitten. Here's where his language does get a little bit confusing. We will sidestep into the final smirk, dally the doom of that inevitable thumb that slowly chafes its puckered index toward us, facing the dull squint with what innocence and what surprise. This is a direct reference to Chaplin's work. And if you go watch it, you'll see he's often in trouble with the cops. And so the cops will point at him. And so the image here is that inevitable thumb that slowly chafes its puckered index toward us. Okay? The cop is going to say, stop, get over here. Who are you? And then Chaplin, right, in the film, he's always like, what? Who, me? What did I do? And then he would run off. Okay? And so that's what the reference here is. It's kind of hard to see, and especially if you haven't watched a lot of Chaplin's films, this dull squint of the cop, right? Now this cop becomes something larger, right? It becomes the idea of authority in general, of any sort of power structure that you can imagine or place above you or place on you in this sense. It could be taxes, it could be the police itself, it could be institutional unfairness, structural unfairness, or inequity in society. Be that, and I just apply that broadly, right? And so, like Chaplin, right, we sort of face this authority pointing its finger at us, and we're like, what? Who, me? What did I do? Right? Tee hee hee. And then, we try to sidestep, okay? We try to dodge that inevitable authority that wants to lord itself over us. And yet, these fine collapses are not lies, more than the pirouettes of any pliant cane. So these little collapses, our little dodges, even sometimes getting caught, right? There's a truth in them. We can't always avoid, right? We can't always avoid authority. And here we get that image of the cane being kind of twirled, right? Chaplin would, he would twirl his cane and lean on it. And if you go and watch the films, he'd lean on it and the cane would kind of bend, kind of a comical image in his films. Our obsequies are, in a way, no enterprise. Now, what does that mean? Now, an obsequy is like funeral rites. Now, he's packing a lot in this line, but to say our obsequies are, in a way, no enterprise means we can't learn to love the world if we are only facing the world through the attitude of our mortality, through the attitude of giving up or giving into that inevitability. Okay, we can't learn to love the world by focusing on death only. Right? We learn to love the world by finding that kitten, by helping it, by helping others, by showing kindness, by showing tenderness and mercy, right? By trying to evade the man, whatever that is, right? Whoever that is. Right? We can evade you, and all else but the heart. Now, this you is authority. It's also death. Obsequies, okay, because of where this line is placed, right? This you can stand in for death as well. We can evade you in all else but the heart. We can't live outside of, right, our heart. What blame to us if the heart live on? Well, isn't that a better attitude? Isn't that a better way, perhaps, of living? The game enforces smirks. Now, a smirk is what? It's a kind of false smile, right? The game here, life, that's what he's talking about, okay? This interplay between us trying to get by, trying to show mercy, trying to just live, versus death, authority, whatever you want to call it, okay? That's the game. But the game, if we say that the game enforces smirks, it might mean that it can make you insincere, right? It can enforce or force you in this attitude of insincerity where we're not finding happiness, we're just getting by, right? The smirk would be to live with an obsequy as your only enterprise. And notice this. Now he contrasts. He contrasts this. For some people, they have this insincere smirk. It's a sort of half smile. But we, notice that contrast. Just like we can still love the world. But so people who perhaps live a little bit more honestly or live a little bit more sincerely can have this transformational attitude. We have seen the moon in lonely alleys make a grail of laughter of an empty ash can. This is one of my favorite images in all of poetry. If you have the right eyes, if you're seeing the world more truly and more accurately, more sincerely, more as a byproduct of your interaction with it as a living, breathing creature, you can see, you can look down this lonely alley, right? And you see this trash can, ash can, trash can, basically what he's describing. You can see that trash can in that lonely alley, bedecked with moonlight. And instead of just seeing trash can, it becomes a grail of laughter. Now, what is exactly a grail of laughter? I don't know. You can't parse that image directly. But it's this idea that it transforms into something far beyond itself. It becomes this, a grail. Okay, we get all of the associations with grail in that. But a grail of laughter. Something ugly, something mundane. This empty trash can in a lonely alley, if we're looking at it correctly, can transform into this almost miraculous thing, a grail of laughter, something beautiful, something unlike a smirk, right? Unlike a smirk, something that is genuine, something that is sincere. And through all sound of gaiety and quest, right, we, by listening, by paying attention, by living more sincerely, we hear that kitten in the wilderness, right? We are attentive to not just our own lives, not just our own sadness, not just our own grief, but we are attuned to the grief in others because we know that just like us, right, everybody else is living under that same aegis. We are all living under that same onus, that burden of our mortality, okay, the authority of whatever it be, okay, does not just affect us. Okay, so this poem is really brilliant for many reasons, but I think, if we look at it as a poem against insincerity and against selfishness, we can kind of see what Hart Crane is doing with this. And this lovely, evocative re-reference to this kitten, right? This tiny, poor little thing that has nobody to help it. Just like nobody is coming to help us. So therefore, we have to do what we can. We have to make our meek adjustments. Find that kitten in the wilderness and see, even in the uglier images, even in the uglier days of our lives, we have to try to see that grail of laughter because that is what it means to be alive. Okay, a little bit of a jump there. Sorry for the time dilation. This poem is by a poet named Jack Gilbert. He lived a very long life. He died just a few years ago. He never published a lot of books over the years, but this poem comes from, I think, his best book called The Great Fires. It's a really good book. I highly recommend reading it. It shows in a way what a poem can do when it's spoken very honestly. And he writes very graphically about, his own biographical experiences. A poet like Hart Crane, whom we just saw, he does write about personal experience, but it's always kind of a bit vaguer. It's a bit more couched in metaphor and allusion. Gilbert just talks directly about, sex, poverty, a lot of there's a lot of sex, but he doesn't do it in a pornographic or denigrating way. Okay, similar to what we saw in the Attitudes from Li Po or Crane. It's more about taking the ephemeral bits of our lives seriously, living them as deeply as we possibly can. And so I think that's what Gilbert is talking about, or what he's doing in a lot of his poems. And a lot of this book is actually about, or focuses on this woman, Michiko, who was his wife, who died, I believe, in her mid-30s of cancer. And he talks very directly about this. In quite a few of the poems, it was a very devastating event for him, obviously. So, this poem is called The Forgotten Dialect of the Heart. And I'll run through a few of the references, like the Sumerian tablets, the Etruscan and Minoan stuff. We'll talk about that in a moment. How astonishing it is that language can almost mean, and frightening that it does not quite. Love, we say, God, we say, Rome and Michiko we write, and the words get it wrong. We say bread, and it means according to which nation. French has no word for home, and we have no word for strict pleasure. A people in northern India is dying out because their ancient tongue has no words for endearment. I dream of lost vocabularies that might express some of what we no longer can. Maybe the Etruscan texts would finally explain why the couples on their tombs are smiling, and maybe not. When the thousands of mysterious Sumerian tablets were translated, they seemed to be business records. But what if they are poems or psalms? My joy is the same as 12 Ethiopian goats standing silent in the morning light. O Lord, thou art slabs of salt and ingots of copper, as grand as ripe barley lithe under the wind's labor. Her breasts are 6 white oxen loaded with bolts of long fibered Egyptian cotton. My love is 100 pitchers of honey. Shiploads of thuya are what my body wants to say to your body. Giraffes are this desire in the dark. Perhaps the spiral Minoan script is not a language, but a map. What we feel most has no name, but amber, archers, cinnamon, horses, and birds. Now, there's a lot going on in this poem, and it starts off basically discussing, and this is not a new concept. I think Gilbert is just tapping into a very, very old concern, right? And it concerns language. How do words mean what they mean? When we say something, we always want our language to be accurate, right? When we say I love you or I hate you, right? We want those words to mean. We want them to communicate exactly what we're feeling. But here's the problem. They never do, right? Because, when you've got two people, right, and they're both thinking of love, well, they each have a very personal, subjective, different attitude toward that word. Even though they both understand it and they both pretty much know what it means, they can't ever know, and we can't ever know, exactly what is meant in language. Okay? We can only know it for ourselves, even though we all agree that there are definitions of things, etc. So this idea of accuracy of language, you can go read Ludwig Wittgenstein on this. I don't necessarily agree with everything he said, but in the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, he does discuss this idea. He actually goes further in the Philosophical Investigations, which is a more readable book. The Tractatus is pretty dense. Anyway, so how do we, I mean, in a poem, we always want our language to be as accurate as possible, right? So what he does is he evokes this idea, right? Love, God, Rome, bread, machiko. And they evoke, these words evoke, but they're always shaded. They're always subjective. They're always clouded by further associations, cultural associations, linguistic associations, right? And so that's one of the major problems that he's discussing here. Another, when he starts bringing up the Etruscan and Sumerian texts, I'm not sure if I brought up the Sumerian texts, but you can see here, like here's some Etruscan tombs. These couples, like these two people here, right, on the tomb. Why are they smiling? They're dead, right? How can that be pleasant? How can that be happy? And so you see, you know, throughout all of these different Etruscan tomb figures, the couples are actually, you know, they're in bed, they're together, they're smiling. I'll leave you to fill in the rest. The Sumerian texts, I'll show you this here. Sumerian. So you had all of these little Sumerian texts, and they had a writing form called cuneiform. It's a bunch of wedge-shaped marks. It's the earliest known written language. We actually did decipher them, so you can go and learn Sumerian. It is not easy. I have actually tried in the last 3 or 4 months on break to learn Sumerian. It is not at all easy. So, but they discovered these actually pretty recently, and then were able to translate them. I won't go into a lecture on that here, although I have done lectures on this discovery and the subsequent controversies that erupted because of them. But it's still, this was an untranslated language for quite a while. So that's what Gilbert is evoking here. These languages that had meaning, they had specific meaning for people. But this idea of translation, okay, becomes central, because if we say love, God, Rome, machiko, bread, it does require a kind of translation. And this is what the title is meant to evoke, this dialect, this idea that, you know, we're always speaking, in a sense, from our heart, our personal experience, our associations, right? And so in that sense, because language is always going to get it wrong, we have to be ever more sincere about the things we say, about the things we write, okay? And he asked this question: what if these Sumerian tablets, are poems or psalms instead of just business records? And here's where the poem for me really takes off. Because what he does is he uses the line, enjambment, and imagery to such a beautiful degree that it's just one of my favorite poems for this. He says, my joy is the same as 12 Ethiopian goats standing silent in the morning light. Well, that's kind of weird. I don't normally think of goats when I think of joy. But notice that image is so striking, it's so direct, that it should at least, I don't know, influence your thinking of. Well, what does joy mean? Is joy just simple happiness? Why can't joy be this image, this beautiful image of these little goats standing silent in the morning light? Like these little goats. I couldn't draw a 12. I didn't want to go microscopic here. But why not? I mean, we don't think of a goat as a beautiful animal, but why not? We don't think of a goat, when we think of a goat, we don't think joy, but why not? When we think of God, right? Notice here, he gives us another image. He doesn't talk about the omnipotent presence of God throughout the universe and all of this, and no. But notice that his language starts to sound biblical. It starts to evoke that poetry that we do find in the Bible. O Lord, thou art slabs of salt and ingots of copper as grand. And now listen to the way this line moves. As grand as ripe barley lies under the wind's labor. And you notice that there's a certain cadence and movement, almost like wind moving through barley out in a field. Okay, this is what I mean when I say you have to read poems out loud until you can hear them in your head. Okay. Her breasts are 6 white oxen loaded with bolts of long fibered Egyptian cotton. Huh? That's kind of a strange thing to say about, maybe somebody you love or somebody you admire or find beautiful. But notice here, once again, it's like, why not? Why can't that image? So you see how specific that image is. When we say beauty, we say love, we say God, right? He's forcing the image on us so that we can't get it wrong. We can't mistake it. So instead of using the language to evoke the idea of beauty, he uses the language to evoke a discordant image that we might never associate with these words, and yet now they're inextricable from one another. My love is 100 pitchers of honey. Beautiful image, right? Shiploads of thuya. It's a kind of wood. It's a hardwood, I believe, from Brazil. It has a really beautiful texture and grain. I was a carpenter for a long time, and so I love wood grain and just the richness of the material itself. So instead of this idea of sex or desire, he once again slams us with this image. Shiploads of thuya are what my body wants to say to your body. And then this is probably my favorite. Giraffes are this desire in the dark. You don't normally think of sex or desire when you think of a giraffe, but now you do. And it's like, well, why not? Giraffes, in fact, beautiful creatures. My goodness. They look awkward, but they're not, right? They're beautiful. They're unique. Okay? So, once again, instead of just desire, love, sex, beauty, whatever, he's making sure that the language gets it right, even though, notice this paradox, it's getting it wrong. That's not a definition of love. That's not a definition of desire. But yet now, because he's pointing out to the natural world, he's pointing out to these images, evoking these images of the natural world. Oxen, goats, salt, copper, barley, cotton, honey, thuya, giraffes, right? We can't escape this. We can't escape his definitions now. The images are forcing us to redefine these words. The poem helps us to see, perhaps through its inaccuracy, how imagery, how language can become accurate if used correctly in a poem like this. Perhaps the spiral Minoan script is not a language, but a map. And this refers to what's called the Phaistos disc. This thing here, I think. Oh. So you see, this is from Minoan civilization. We have not translated this. It's more or less a hieroglyphic script, and they've gone through and they've tried to figure out, well, what on earth is being represented here. Certain characters are repeated. These seem to be blocking, right, the little symbols together. So is this a sentence? Is it a word? We have no idea. Okay, but notice this. Maybe it's a map. Maybe even in this untranslated language, right? This isn't. We're reading it wrong. We're seeing it wrong. We're not envisioning this correctly, perhaps, he says. Now, is this a language? Yes, of course. Is this a map? No. You see, the poem doesn't need to be responsible to fact. It needs to be responsible to the poem, to the poet, and to the subject. This is what I mean when I say that the poem doesn't need to be true, so to speak. What we feel most, everything, joy, desire, lust, happiness, all fear, hatred, all of this, what we feel most has no name. Just as giraffes can be desire, goats can be joy, God can be salt and copper and barley. What we feel most has no name but amber, archers, cinnamon, horses, and birds. Once again, just evoking a kind of random list, but still in its randomness, right? This type of, it's kind of a resin, fossilized resin. Why archers? Well, why not? Cinnamon, why not? Horses, why not? Birds, why not? These are things out there in the world, physical things, right? And he ties those physical things, not through definitions, not through names and association, but rather dissociation to the natural world, using the imagery to perhaps discuss these hard to define qualities in such a way now that we can't help but see them in a new light, in a new way. And that is what poetry intends to do. It needs to always try to recast the common bits and pieces of this world in a new way, in evocative language, such that we can't, after we're done reading a poem, we can't see it any other way but that now. So I'm hoping that the next time you think of the word joy, you think of goats. The next time you think of lust or whatever, right? You think giraffes. When you think of God, you think of salt and copper and barley. Okay? So I think it's just a really beautiful poem for what it does in the imagery here after having evoked the idea in the first half of the poem. So I hope that helps a little bit. These are just 3 poems I kind of took at random. These were just books that were on my desk upstairs. So I thought, oh, okay, well, I'll just do a discussion on these. And notice, once again, it's line and image, line and image, line and image. It's not just about the idea of the poem. It's also the functional working parts of the poems themselves. So I hope that helps, and thank you.